began. How many New Testaments were available when the church began? There were none. It wasn't until decades later that the New Testament, at least decades, that the New Testament was fully put together so that people had a volume of all the letters that were in the New Testament. And there is a microphone coming. Can you hear me in the back all right? Okay, so far so good. I'll just keep hollering and we'll go from here. The first passage that's down there is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. And what Jesus says here is that he is, well, let's go through it together and we'll just read what it says. And what I've done is selected some passages where Jesus himself speaks with reference to the scriptures, and the scriptures here, of course, in view are the old scriptures, what we would call the Old Testament. Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that was written in the Old Covenant. The whole thing was about his coming. It was to prepare us for that. And so when he came, he fulfilled that. And what's it mean to fulfill something? To complete it. You've got the word fill in there. And when you fill something full, you can't get any more in it. And that's what Jesus did. Everything that was written in the Old Testament. And it's interesting to study the Old Testament with this view in mind, that it's all about the coming of Christ. Everything is pointing to that. John chapter 5 and verse 39. Who's got that? Anybody?
John 5:39.
Yes, 5:39.
You study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me.
These are the scriptures that testify about me. Who says that? Jesus. So he's making the claim. When you read the old scriptures, you're reading what testifies about me. Luke chapter 24. We're looking at verses 25 and 27 first. Who's got that? I'd like to read it. All right.
And he said to them, O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter his glory? Beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them things concerning himself in all the scripture.
Very good. So Jesus is with these two guys. They're heading to a town called Emmaus or Emmaus. I'm not sure exactly how it should be pronounced. They probably knew. What we do understand completely is what Jesus says about the scriptures. Everything that was in those scriptures, it's all right if they see you. Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah.
Look at verse 25. Yes, understand it, and what else? It's right there. Believe it. I really think it's interesting that the choice of words he uses. Oh, foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? These guys were upset. They were troubled because of what had happened to Jesus. And he's saying, why are you upset? If you had read the scriptures and understood them the way they were written to you, you would have known that this was the plan. This is the way it was supposed to work. Now, on one hand, I don't know how anybody could have experienced the death of Jesus and everything that he went through and not be upset. But it's kind of like when Jesus was talking to Peter, and Peter told Jesus with the other apostles that he was going to be arrested, going to be tried, going to be put to death. And what did Peter say? Peter said, essentially, over my dead body. I'll never let that happen. And what did Jesus tell him? Get behind me, Satan. He called Peter Satan. Why did he call Peter Satan? Because Peter didn't want Jesus to die. Wait a minute. Isn't that kind of strange? What Jesus is trying to get him to understand is that God had a plan. And the most important thing was not Jesus' welfare, but the fulfillment of that plan. Jesus came to fulfill that plan, and that was first and foremost in his mind. What was it Jesus prayed in the garden? What was the first thing Jesus asked for in the garden? Let this cup pass. And then what did he say? Not my will, but thine be done. He prayed to the Father. He knew what he was facing. At least I think he knew what he was facing. And so he asked, if there's any way, let this cup pass, but not my will, but yours. That's exactly the kind of prayer that you and I should be praying all the time, because we do not know what is best for us, but God does. All right, that's 24, 25, and 27. Somebody read 44 through 47. Anybody got that? All right, very good. Now, does anybody have chapter 24, verses 44 to 47? Let's read that. Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Now he said to them, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, thus it is written, that the Christ would suffer and rise again from the dead the third day, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem.
Who wrote about this according to Jesus? Moses. Who else? The Psalms, the prophets. Are there any prophecies about Jesus in the writings of Moses or in the writings of the prophets or in the Psalms? Oh yeah, it's filled with them. We're going to look at a few here in just a little bit. So these are 4 passages where Jesus is saying, you need to read the Old Testament essentially, because that's what testifies of me. And when you read that, you're going to see me all the way through it. As a matter of fact, he says, I am the fulfillment of the Old Covenant. So with that in mind, let's look at a few examples. Philip uses Isaiah chapter 53 in Acts chapter 8. You may recall this situation where there was an Ethiopian eunuch riding from Jerusalem, going back home. Why had he been to Jerusalem? Anybody remember? He'd been there to worship. He'd been there to worship God. This guy's from Ethiopia, and he'd been there to worship God. And he's riding back, and he's reading from the prophet Isaiah. Had his Kindle with him. Had the battery fully charged. Probably reading from a scroll. Can you imagine riding in a chariot, reading from a scroll? How much do you want to know what's in that scroll? How curious are you? Or you've got some kind of a desire to put that kind of energy into reading while you're in a chariot. I've never ridden in a chariot. I don't know what kind of chariot this guy had, but I'm pretty sure he had a scroll, and it's not exactly like we've got today in our wonderful, comfortable vehicles. At any rate, that's where they are. That's what he's doing. The Spirit of God and an angel provoked Philip to go join himself. And what question does Philip ask the eunuch? Do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch replies, How can I understand unless some man guide me? So Philip got up in the chariot with him. They were reading from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. And saying that reminds me, I meant to have a video clip available for this part of the class. I don't know how many of you have gone to, it's a website that shows Jewish people who have started studying the New Testament and coming to faith in Jesus. And one of the things that they all say is, when you read the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, it is unmistakable that our Jewish prophet was telling us about the coming of Christ. And they all say essentially the same thing. How did we not know this? How did we not see this? They read this 53rd chapter and they go, well, that's Jesus. And there's no way to deny that the things that happened to Jesus happened to him. They've been so firmly recorded in history. There's a solid basis for their belief because of such testimony that we have. And it's right there in Isaiah. And Isaiah is 700 years plus, years prior to the coming of the Christ. So it's hard to mistake what's going on there. That's the passage that the Ethiopian eunuch is reading. Here it is in verse 32, Acts chapter 8, verse 32. He was led as a sheep to slaughter, as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he does not open his mouth. In humiliation his judgment was taken away. Who will relate his generation? For his life is removed from the earth. And what was the eunuch's question? Who's he talking about? That's coming. That's in chapter 16. He says, who's this guy talking about? And Philip, it says in verse 35, opened his mouth, and what did he do? He preached Jesus to him. He opened his mouth and he preached Jesus to him. From what text? Isaiah 53. And it's interesting, I'm not trying to push any personal agenda, but what was the result of Philip studying Isaiah 53 with the eunuch? Baptism. The eunuch says, well, here's water. What keeps me from being baptized? Now, you can read the 53rd chapter of Isaiah all day long if you want to. You won't ever read baptism in there. So who must have brought baptism into it? Must have been Philip. Well, where did Philip get the idea of baptism? It was in Jesus, the one who fulfilled the law. Did the law say that there would be a messenger who would precede the coming of the Christ? It did. Who was that messenger? John who? John the Baptizer. Isn't that interesting that God said, I'm going to choose one prophet to precede my son. This prophet's going to prepare people's hearts for the coming of my son. And what this guy is going to do is baptize. That was the question. The baptism of John, Jesus asked the Pharisees, was it from God or was it from men? Why did he ask if it was from God? Because it was from God. John didn't get on the scene and say, let's see, what can I do to get people's attention? I know, I'll baptize people. No, his baptism was from God. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 7, verse 30, Luke writes that the Pharisees rejected God's purpose for themselves, not receiving the baptism of John. So they were rejecting John's baptism. And in so doing, they were rejecting God's purpose for themselves. So John came to introduce people to the Christ, and he did that around this teaching of baptism. The death, burial, and resurrected, we now know, is what baptism is all about. And Philip is teaching the eunuch about baptism on the basis of the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Now, the 53rd chapter is not about baptism, quote unquote, not about baptism, but what is it about? It's about Jesus dying, yes. Is baptism about Jesus' death? Exactly, that's the connection. And so Jesus comes on a scene, and we are told in John chapter 1 and verse 12, if you believe that God has sent Jesus, God will give you the right to become a child of God. And then John chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus, and he says, we know you're from God, because nobody could do the things you do unless God sent him. And Jesus says, well, then you need to be born again.
Jesus doesn't say, well, you need to believe, because he already believes. And if he believes, he's got the right to become a child of God. And Jesus immediately says, you need to be born again by water and the Spirit of God. All that's coming together right here. Yes, Mike.
Additional comment about Isaiah 53. The question is, so if the Jews are reading Isaiah 53, what do they say that it means? And they're asking that in response to the teacher. He said that the Jews believe that Israel, that Isaiah is talking about, is the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel, they're the subjects. The nation of Israel, they're the ones that are being crushed. They're the ones that are suffering openly, the Holocaust, and all those things that are happening to them in order to reveal true God. So that's how they interpret Isaiah 53. It doesn't stand up dramatically because,
Right.
The other thing too is that the Jews never were like sheep to the slaughter. They were always stiff-necked, uncircumcised, always rebelling. So the character that's described in 53 doesn't fit well.
Exactly.
It does fit continue. But anyway, I just thought,
Right.
well, when the Jews think about it, that's how they.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think it was Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, was told, go out to Nebuchadnezzar and present yourself before him, and it will go well with you. And Zedekiah said, I ain't going to do that. And so instead of going out and being greeted by Nebuchadnezzar and being taken in peace, his sons were killed before him. That was the last thing he saw, because then his eyes were put out and he was thrown into prison. So if God tells you to do something, even if it doesn't sound smart to you, you better do it, because that's always the smartest thing, whatever God says. And that's interesting, because we're talking about baptism, and there are so many people who say, oh, baptism's, you're not saved by water baptism. Well, Philip preached Jesus from Isaiah 53, and when the eunuch said, hey, here's water, what hinders me to be baptized? Did Philip say, oh, you don't need to be baptized, you can do that later? He said, right on. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? That was the next question. All right, there we are from that. And I know what you're doing probably. You're looking at this saying, man, if he takes 15 minutes on that one, how long is it going to take us to get through this stuff? We're waiting for Johnny's timer to go off so we can get a cookie. 10 minutes? All right, hang on, just 10 more minutes. Paul testified to this in Acts chapter 13. We won't spend as much time on the rest of them, I promise. But in Acts chapter 13, verses 26 to 29, who's got that and is ready to read it?
Brothers, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who fear God, to us has been sent the message of this salvation. For those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not recognize him, nor understand the utterances of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, fulfilled them by condemning him. And though they found in him no guilt worthy of death, they asked Pilate to have him executed.
So what does it say about what they're doing in the Sabbath, or what they're doing every Sabbath in the synagogue? They are reading the scriptures that are telling them about the Christ. And I've wondered to myself, didn't the priests know not to bargain with Judas for 30 pieces of silver? Why would they not do that? Because that's in prophecy. That's in Zechariah. It's noted here a little farther on down. So it seems like if they would have known the scriptures, they would have said, well, we don't make a deal for 30 pieces of silver. And for sure, if we do make a deal for 30 pieces of silver, when we get it back, don't buy a potter's field, because all that's in prophecy. All these things. Okay, Paul practiced this in Acts chapter 18, verse 5. Who's got that?
Timothy came from Macedonia. Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah.
What did Paul devote himself to? To the Word. What Word? Well, the only Word he had was the Old Covenant. Those Scriptures were what they were preaching from. And it says when he used those Scriptures, devoting himself to that he was solemnly testifying to the Jews Jesus was the Christ. I put that together to mean that was his testimony. Look at these texts of Scripture right here, and they'll show you that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. Apollos in chapter 18, a little further on down, it says in verse 24, there was a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was, how is he described? Mighty in the Scriptures. And those had to be the Old Testament Scriptures. And it says a little farther on down, verse 28, he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating by the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Look at all those interesting words. Powerfully. Powerfully did what? Refuted. What's it mean to refute? Okay, that's the second time you fute. The first time is fute, and the second time is a refute. So, well, we know what a refute is. That's when somebody says something and you know it's not right, and you use facts and information to counter that falsehood. And that's what Apollos was doing with the Scriptures. And he was doing it powerfully. And who was he doing it with? The Jews. Who were the Jews? They were the ones that had the Scriptures. But Apollos is using their own Scriptures to powerfully refute them in private, in public. So that's the power of the Old Testament Scriptures. And he was proving that Jesus was the Christ. All right, what text could they have used? If Apollos was doing this, what passages of Scripture from the Old Testament might he have been using? It doesn't give us an outline of his sermon. Wouldn't you like to have that? But we do know that there were some passages that he could have used. The first one's in Genesis 3:15. Genesis chapter 3 is where Adam and Eve sinned, and the serpent tempted Eve, and she ate the forbidden fruit. What do you always see pictured for the fruit? You always see an apple. I don't know, why don't they have a banana? There's a lot of people saying these days, oh, you shouldn't eat bananas, they got too many calories. It'll make you too smart. But it's always an apple. Now that bell, that wasn't Johnny's timer.
Yeah, it was, because I was 5 minutes off. It's 20 now.
You mean
I made a mistake.
5 minutes ago we could have had a cookie. All right. Well, we'll come back to this point in, let's take 15. I think we've got time to take 15. And communion? Anybody who would like to observe communion, just follow Mike down the hall.